You want to mute everybody?
I have. I remembered. Okay. So let's share the screen. Okay. Now, this is this talk is really about an area that most people don't know anything about and really don't care, but it's a fascinating area to study, and I'll try and make it as fascinating as I can for you. So, generally, reproductive systems are to get sex cells together. In plants, it's the same thing, but sometimes they're not sex cells. Sometimes they're a little bit different. They're called spores. We'll get to it later. Now, we have asexual reproduction. That means it's not sex, not two things together, not two cells. And once the spores are produced, they have to be dispersed. So this is the asexual reproduction with the spores. With a sexual reproduction, you have to have the right environment for this fertilization to occur. And once the seeds are produced, they have to be dispersed. Now, the last thing you want is a plant producing thousands of seeds and they all fall down at the base of the plant, and you get a lot of competition for the needs of those seeds, and the whole thing just falls apart. So the seeds have to move as far away as possible. Now, what sort of plants have we got? Basically, we've got the algae. They're water-based. We've got plants which are non-vascular. They're small enough not to need vessels going through them to supply them with nutrients and water. So things they're called the bryophytes. You've all heard of mosses. You may not have heard of liverworts. Then we've got the vascular plants. They have the vessels in them. That means much bigger, and you've got to get nutrients and water from the soil fairly high up. And these are tracheophytes. Now, you may remember from another talk, the part of the word, this one, phytes means plants. Tracheo, as in tube, and we have one in our throat, the trachea, from that word. And the very early ones are the ferns. But ferns do not produce seeds. Then we have the seed plants, which are next generation, the next level higher than that. They're called spermatophytes. Again, they're plants that produce sperm, which means two sexes. And these are broken down into two groups. What I call the gymnosperms, the naked seeds. Now, the word gymno, naked, that we use comes from the Greek that they used to have do exercise in gymnasiums. Now, a gymnasium is a place where everyone is naked, but only the men, of course, and they fight or they do whatever they do. So the naked seeds, and they're the conifers, the pines, and those sorts of plants. And then we have the angiosperms, and these are more covered seeds, and they have food for the embryo within the seed, and they're the flowering plants. Now we've got two groups of those. So we've got what are called the monocotyledons, and when the seed germinates, only one leaf comes out, mono. And the grasses, the palms, but I'll get into more detail with that later. And then the most recent ones, the dicotyledons, they produce two new leaves, out of the seed. Now, the sequence that you see in front of you is the evolutionary sequence. Okay, let's look at spores. We'll compare spores and seeds. So bacteria, plant, fungi, algae, they're all used, not all plants, of course, but spores. Oops, wrong way. Now, they are tiny, they are single cells and they are microscopic. So you can't actually see them with the naked eye unless there's a cloud of them flying by. They can move around. Whereas seeds, they are the main way of plants reproducing. There are other ways, which I'll get to later, but the seeds are the primary way. And the seeds that can easily be seen, they're quite large, and you eat them, those of you who eat seeds, or see seeds, or see them on your bread, like poppy or sesame, that's how big they are. But within them, they all have an embryo, a developing embryo. So a little bit of genetics, which we need to do to understand this. Now, most organisms have 2 sets of chromosomes in every cell. Now, we do too, except red blood cells, because they don't have a nucleus. So within the nucleus of all our other cells, there are 2 sets of chromosomes. And for us, 1 set comes from the mother, 1 set comes from our father. Now, so each parent contributed a set, and each parent's set is set to have what we call the haploid number. Now, I'm not going to go into mitosis and meiosis in this talk, so this is very, very basic now. When with animals, the sperm has 1 set of chromosomes, and the egg has another set of chromosomes. In animals, in plants, it's the same. 1 set is said to be the haploid number, and we give the letter N for number. A full set is the diploid number, 2 sets. So therefore, it's 2N, and it'll come up shortly. So in mitosis, that's when we have a normal cell in the body, not a sex cell, a normal body cell. When it reproduces, it produces 2 identical cells. So if you have a cell that's undergoing reproduction, and it's happening in us millions of times as we speak, and these cells are all diploid, and the daughter cells, as they're called, the new cells that have been formed, have exactly, there has to be exactly the same information and in the new cells. Otherwise, the whole thing breaks down. It doesn't work. So again, the diploid number in every one of our cells is the same. It has to be the same. Now, the other mechanism is meiosis, which produces gametes. Now, gametes are the sex cells like sperm, like ova, eggs, and they produce different information because the process of going through meiosis is quite complicated, and they end up with the haploid number, or N number. Okay, that's the genetics for the day. So once you have an idea of that, the green algae, they have a life cycle, and most more primitive plants have a cycle, and they now talking about a diagram here. There's a diagram, but I couldn't do both together and have everything in one slide. So it's the next slide, and I'll come back and show you. So we're looking at gametes, egg and sperm, which are produced by mitosis. Okay. So, but they are still the N number. So one set of chromosomes. And these fuse together, they come together to produce a zygote. Now, the zygote is the first cell, whether it's in us or in green algae, the word is the same. And they have the diploid number. So they have two sets of chromosomes. Now, these diploid cells, or they're called the diploid generation, again, refers to the diagram, they produce the spores by meiosis. So we go from mitosis to meiosis. It's a complicated system, but they've survived all these billions of years, and they settle on the rocks, then they grow into what's called a haploid generation. That every cell in there, in them, is haploid. That means half the number of chromosomes. And then with green algae, though, you can't really tell the difference between the haploid and the diploid. Okay, and because they've got two sets of generations, one's diploid and one's haploid, the process is called alternation of generation. They alternate at different times of the year. So here's the diagram. So here you have, notice here on the left, they have one N, and on the right they have two N. Now, this is what you see, the green things, and you really can't tell the difference much. So what happens here, these gametophytes, these are plants that produce the gametes. The gametes have to be N, or N number, the single, a single set of chromosomes. So we have the gametes, they're like the sperm and the egg, or these where the gametes, that's on the tip here. This is where the gametes are formed, there and there, from two different plants, and they come together to produce a zygote, 2N. Right? Okay, two N's, add them together, we get 2N, and then they grow into what's called a sporophyte. So this one's called a gametophyte, produce gametes. These are the gametes. The sporophyte then produces spores. And they are these, through mitosis, they reproduce exactly the same, and they produce these guys. And then it just goes on and on and on ad infinitum. And they have been extremely successful. This may be somewhat confusing to someone who hasn't come across this idea of alternation of generation, but they are different circumstances. They need different environments sometimes to even survive in. All right, so here's another diagram of these, a simpler version. Okay, here's the gametophyte. They produce the gametes, two gametes that fuse together, produce a zygote. Now these are 2N, diploid. They undergo mitosis, and that's like our cells undergo mitosis, the results are the same. And you get these sporophytes. Sporophytes are released through the process of meiosis, so they get half the number, N, and we get the cycle. Let's move on to something a little bit that's more common to you, I think. Things like the mosses and the bryophytes. So mosses and liverworts. Now, I'm sure you all know what a moss looks like. They're like a green, lovely, plush cushion. The liverworts are totally different. So these photos this is what the mosses are like when they're reproducing. If they're not reproducing, they're basically that on what's down there, but cushiony. These are the liverworts. So these are spore-producing plants, but without the flowers. No flowers. Guess that they're very, very primitive. We're talking about hundreds of millions of years. Okay, so the mosses here, there are lots and lots of species, and each one's slightly different. And these would have these stalks, and in these little bubbly things here, they call them the spore capsules. It's where the spores are produced. So this is the diploid phase here. Now, the liverworts, the capsules are in the leaf itself. So you can see some, this one here is not quite ready yet, but these ones have opened up. And so they've released their spores and they've been dispersed. And this usually happens at a time of the year when whatever mechanism they rely on, like water or wind or whatever, is around for them to be able to do that and survive nicely. Now, some of these also have capsules like this. These are related, by the way, but not that closely. Okay, so with the bryophytes, what we just looked at, is just a diagram. So we have the spores being produced. They go around and produce male and female plants here, males and females. How they determine which is a male, which is a female, I have no idea. But the anthers, now this word antheridia is used in modern plants as well for the anthers where the pollen is. But these guys don't produce pollen, they produce tiny single cells which are haploid. Okay, this green bit you see up here, these are all haploid here, and they can swim. And they swim to the female section, which produces an egg. Okay, these are all haploid, single cell, single batch, a single set of chromosomes. And then the sperm and the egg get together, and they become, they're fertilized, of course, and then they become a diploid. So then the zygote grows, you get an embryo, you get a nice sporophyte coming out here, and then here the sporophytes of the moss, and they undergo meiosis, and then we start the process again. So meiosis will give us the haploid number, the half the number. Now, down here, I just added a little bit of information. This happens in water. Mosses do not survive, or the bryophytes do not survive out of water, because these guys have to swim to get there. And they, theoretically, we think they developed about 460 million years ago, and there are about 20,000 species around the world. So here's a diagram to show the same thing. Where should we start? Well, here you've got the spores. The spores germinate, and you get the gametophytes, and then you get the male and the female, the sperm and the egg. The process, you get the archegonium growing, the zygotes in there, you get your enlarged bit here, and the capsules are formed, and within the capsules undergo meiosis, and then we start off again. It's the same process, just a different diagram, just to make sure that you get it through. And you see here, these sperm, they do swim with the little tails on them.
It's a little question with these sperms or seeds, would there be any crossbreeding? Like if it's in the water, would there be any random mixing of the cells?
I don't know, but for it to be successful, they would have to have the same number of chromosomes. Because when you get to this stage here, if you've got, I have no idea what the numbers are. Say they've got 10 chromosomes in each, in the N generation, and put them together, you get the 2N. But the two sets have to match each other. It's like taking two mammals, a dog and a cat, and trying to match them. I don't think you'd get them. I don't know how closely related mosses are. I'm not a botanist, but it's possible if they're close enough, but I don't know. I really don't.
Okay.
Now with ferns, they are almost as ancient as the mosses. These are the dating these about 360 million years, and they're much older than land animals and much older than dinosaurs. Dinosaurs. Let me think. The dinosaurs came out about 250 million years ago. Okay, so ferns were even 200 million years before flowering plants. The flowering plants are much newer. Now, they are vascular. Now, that means they have vessels which can collect water from the soil. They can collect minerals and other things that are required by the leaves, by the fronds. So that can get much bigger because the algae and because the mosses, the bryophytes, are so they don't have any vessels, so they can't get big unless algae can if they live in water, because they're completely surrounded in water and they get the minerals and whatever they need from the water. But if they live on land, they just can't grow. There isn't the possibility for them to get what they need. Once they've developed vessels, well, then you've got these tube systems within them, and you get your water nutrients. So these ones here, the ferns, they grow from the seed directly, they produce these. I'll have to go through. I'll go through it with you. But they produce are produced from spores themselves. Now, spores again are not sex related, so and then they're quite complicated, and there has to be water. And the others, of course, needed water as well, for the mosses and so on. But because these have got the vessels, they're vascularized, they can be much bigger, but they still need water for the reproduction aspect of it. So you can't, if it's totally dry, they'll die off. Now, underneath the frond, now a fern, the leaf, if you like, is not a leaf, it's a frond. And they're little clumps, they're usually brownish in color, and they look like little bits stuck onto it. And the pinnae are the little sections. I'll show you I've got photos coming up. And this is where the spores developed. And these little pinnae, these are little brown things, are called sporangia, the casings where the spores form. Okay, so a fern section, the leaf, if you like, this is a frond. And each one of these is a pinna. And each little one is a pinule. And they have a midrib and an apex. And then if you look here, there are three different ones here. And these are the sporangia. Okay, so the sporangia are clumped into the sort of, this is a kangaroo fern. And so there's a pinule, and each of these produces spores. Okay, so these are sporangia. Photo B, which is this one, is what's called a soft tree fern, and this one here is the maidenhair fern, but they're not on the actual I've lost the word, but they're just on the edges. Okay, so they're quite different. So again, alternation of generation. So you have the sporangium starting here from the clusters of the sporangia that produce spores. Now, this is fascinating. These are spores. Now, every cell in this thing here called a prothallus, every cell is haploid, single set of chromosomes. So what happens here is they grow, they're probably a few millimeters across. They're fairly flat because they need a large surface area to volume ratio to get the nutrients in the water they need. They grow little roots here, and they this sort of a heart-shaped thing, and this is facing down in the water. This is the bottom of it. And in one section here, in this bit, they produce the female area. It's called the archegonium. It's a female. And these bits here, the antheridium, is a male section. Now, through mitosis, they produce these sections here where the sperm that's here and here. Okay, so it's a sequence. The sperm are produced here. The archegonium is here and produces eggs, and the sperm move across to the egg, fertilize it, and you've got a zygote. Now, because each cell in the prothallus is haploid, remember, half the number, when you combine the two together, you get a diploid cell. The diploid cell, which is the zygote, then is released and produces what's called a sporophyte. That's called a sporophyte because when it grows up, it becomes mature, it produces spores, these. So here we are, a baby sporophyte. It produces roots. It produces fronds. And, and on these fronds, we get the sporangia, and then we start the process again. Now, of course, there are many different ferns around, huge numbers of different ones, but they all work on the same basis, and they all require water. So here's a lovely, this bit here, part of the diagram here. So coming out of the prothallus, it grows a new frond, and there's a baby frond. And this is, as it grows, it unwinds itself. So it's quite a complicated it's beautiful to see. Now, conifers, so the pines, for example. Now, these are a group of plants called gymnosperms because the seeds do not have the fruit around them. They are called naked seeds. So all that produces the seed, and the seeds are released. Whereas with when you have a fruit, the seed will have something to nourish it later. So the earliest conifers are around 300 million years ago, and the early ones, the early conifers, were the cycads and the ginkgos, and they were they look similar they're different, but they evolved separately, but probably from a common ancestor. I don't know. Now, they had three important adaptations. One, they are not so dependent on water. They need water like the plants that we have in our garden, but they don't depend on water for reproduction. They produce pollen. So the sex cells do not have to swim through water. And then they produce seeds, which carries the embryo, and it can be transported. And the transport could be through wind, or animals eating it, or insects like ants carrying it away. So it's a revolutionary system compared to what was. And we're still talking about 300 million years. So here's some examples. This is a cycad, and they have, it looks like a common fern, but it's not. It's very, very old. This is a ginkgo, and the ginkgo has the spores grow around the edges. Now, and these are different conifers from around the world, like the cedar of Lebanon, there's a fir tree, a spruce. Now, you've all seen cones. Now, there are two types of cones in these conifers, the female cone and the male cone. Now, these scales, this cone that's being held here is an old one. It's all the scales are open. Behind each, say, take this one here, underneath that, there's one egg. Well, it's a group of cells which carry an egg. So now, let me just go this one. I'll go back to the one before. This evolutionary change required certain things to happen. The conifers, or the ferns, not the ferns, the pines here, for example, notice pines drop their lower branches as they grow. When it's windy, the wind comes in, but then it, as well as going through, it also goes up. And this is the beauty of this system. It's the wind that pollinates the cones. So here we have drawing of a cone, and it's a sporophyte. Okay, it's 2N. The male cones are found down the bottom. The female cones are found at the top, from the middle up. Now, so they produce the sperm, if you like, and these produce the ovules, and when the wind comes through, it picks the timing is such that the sperm and the eggs are ready to fertilize each other in the season where the wind is there. So the windy season, in whatever part of the world they are, they develop like this, and then the wind picks up the sperm, pushes it up the tree. And this drawing is not very accurate because it should be the other way around. You need to turn the 180, but it's the best one I could find. And the wind pushes the sperm and the meat up with the ovules. So here's a female cone. Notice it's in the pointing down, and this is a male cone. Now the male cones are very, very small, and most people don't even know they're there. So each of these eggs in here, well, sorry, in the scale, that's a scale, that's part of the scale, is an ovule. And the pollen grain comes in, and the pollen grain then grows and meets up with the ovule through a pollen tube. Excuse me. So we have the fertilization process here, and they produce seeds. And then again, because the sperm and the eggs are haploid, when you get the result of the combination here, when they fuse together, you end up with seeds which are diploid. And then these are dispersed. And again, these are gymnosperms, they're naked seeds. There's nothing, well, there's nothing around them to give them nourishment once they go. So it's a fascinating difference that you can see the change from, say, the evolutionary sequence that we've been looking at. It gets more and more complicated, and it works well. In fact, long before the the flowering plants came along, the world was full of conifers. However, the flowering plants are much more efficient. So these are angiosperms. So these are, it means seeds in a vessel. Sperm is a seed, angio, I don't speak Greek, but it's a vessel. And they are very, very diverse. And they are found everywhere. And they are seed producing, just like the gymnosperms, which are the naked ones, but they can distinguish because of certain characteristics, like they have flowers. That's why they're called flowering plants. They have an endosperm in the seed. An endosperm provides the embryo food. And the fruit that contains the seed. So they have different ways of actually dispersing the seeds because of the fruit. So if we're looking at the evolution, so the flowering plants diverged around 245 to 200 million years ago. Very hard to put an exact time on it. And they and the first flowering plants that existed that we've got evidence for is about 140 million years ago. Now, as I said, just to give you an idea, we talked about dinosaurs at the time section. They came through about 250 million years ago. They developed from there, and the big ones, they all died. The big ones died off about 65 million years ago, when that when there was this great big asteroid that hit the Earth. But that's another story. Now they became widespread about 100 million years ago, and they replaced the conifers as the dominant, because they had more ways of reproducing. But they became dominant between 60 and 100 million years ago. Okay, So this was happening still with the when the dinosaurs were around, but by this stage, mammals, little mammals, were already in existence. Now, the flowers are diverse, but they're basically the same process right through them. They have they are so the differences between them, but the whole idea is to produce seeds. So the flowers aid this domination of over the angiosperms because they can adapt to just about every part of the world, even Antarctic. So the Arctic Circle has got these short plants called the Arctic daisy. It's very small, beautiful flower, and that's another talk. I won't go there now. It's amazing what it does. Now this diversity, being all of the world, it really dominated every part of the system, the terrestrial ecosystem, as we call it. Here's a series of photos of just different types of flowers. And so from the tiny to the obvious, and there's a huge variety, and depending on what part of the world, and even same genera, they have different species, different parts of the world. So how do how do these flowers reproduce? So they have the male's part, and the male part of the flower is called the stamen. You can remember that by the men. So there are three parts to that: the filament, the anther, and then the pollen. The females are called the pistil. I don't know what the origin of that name is. And then they have what's called the stigma, the style, the ovaries, the ovules, and the receptacle. It's more complicated than the male, like in humans. So here's a diagram of a flower. And so, well, let's start with the female. It's in the middle here. This is the ovary. Within the ovary, we have the ovules. They're the eggs, if you like. Here's a style, and the top of it is the stigma. That's a sticky bit that the pollen sticks to. The male bits are here, and they're the anther. That's where the pollen matures and disperses from. And then we have the filament. We also have the leaves, which you can't see, but modified leaves are called the sepal. So when you see a flower in bud like that, it looks like it's got leaves around it. Those leaves are called sepals. An older word is calyx. And then, of course, you've got the petals. And the petals have particular function also, mainly to attract insects. By the way, here, the word stamen refers to the male parts, and the carpel or the pistil, that's all that section here, is the female part. So, just a table here. I think I've added these to the notes just to give you an idea of definitions, if you like, for the names of the different parts. There's also many differences about the actual flowers and the different ways of doing it. So this is called inflorescence. So there are a lot of the flowers that you know of are just single flowers. But when you've got multiple flowers in a particular arrangement, that's called an inflorescence. So it's a cluster of flowers on a branch or a system of branches. So it's categorized by the arrangement. And I won't go through them all, but just to show you that there are many, many different versions depending on where they are. So this is included the grasses and these are sedges, these are the composites. It's just an interesting thing that they developed. This is why I'm showing it to you. There's such a huge variety of flowering plants. So just to give you that, so this is just a very brief list of types of inflorescence, and it's the floral structures. There's the spikes, so they're elongated, unbranched, like that. The spikelet, the small of them, they're a bit like here, the spikelet there. The long ones, short ones with grasses and sedges, and then you've got the racemes. They're elongated, they're unbranched, and intermediate, and so on. So, like these sorts of things here. So they're all different. And then you get the panicles, and they're a branched raceme. Just a technical thing. Now, pollen, amazing. No two plants have pollen that look the same. Here is a group I found of different pollen, and they're all, I mean, there's some of these that look the same, and they probably are, but there's a huge, massive variety of different shapes. And don't forget, these are haploid. They only have half the number of chromosomes, and they have many mechanisms there that carry the pollen to the stigma. Now, the stigma is the top of the female parts. Now, every species has its own specific pollen shape. So as many species as you can imagine, there's that many pollen shapes. And each pollen is transferred from one pollen to another, one plant to another, and that's called cross-pollination. And that's what you want, really, usually, to get the genetics being quite stable then, and improving on the genetics as well. And the word that we use for the joining of the two male-female nuclei is fertilization, as you all know, I'm sure. But we also have a thing called cross-fertilization. So fertilization normally happens by insects carrying the pollen. Like the bee goes in, it's got special pollen sacs on its legs, and on its body as well, it's got pollen grains. And this little diagram here, where the stigma picks up some pollen from the bee. Birds, mammals, wind, water, different ways of different plants to move its pollen around. So most flowers have both sexes, but some plants need a separate male and a female individual. So palms, kiwis, and marijuana, they actually have male plants and female plants. And there are other plants that self-pollinate, like tomatoes. So they actually, there's the female stigma and so on, the pollen, and they actually pollinate themselves. So they're totally different sorts of pollen. They don't fly around in the wind, and insects don't carry them anywhere. And usually the petals, these faint gray thing, they're still closed because it all happens unseen. So we've got the self-pollinators, which means the diversity, the genetic diversity is limited, unless it's done artificially. Sometimes we get double fertilization, and that's a new. Sorry, with flowers we get double fertilization, and it's an evolutionary innovation, which is amazing. Okay, so first of all, the egg is the first gamete. A gamete is a sex cell, and its fertilization gets the zygote. So we need to get something to fertilize the gamete to get the zygote. We have a central cell. I'll show you the diagram. We have an egg, and we have another cell, and it's the second female gamete, which leads to the endosperm. And now the endosperm in a seed has oils and carbohydrates as a food source for the seed. So it's very important to be able to keep seed for a length of time, because we can keep them because they do have a food source. So, so you can see here, here's your stigma. There's the pollen grain there. It's got sperm cells, nuclei, and there's a third one called the tube cell nucleus. Here we have the ovary, we have an egg, we have a central cell there, and that's the ovule. The pollen on the stigma is actually quite sticky, but I should mention that when bees or birds or whatever is pollinating the flowers, they leave lots of different pollen on the stigma. Only the pollen of that particular species is allowed to grow. The others just fade away. So the correct species one starts to grow and produces what's called a pollen tube. At the head of the pollen tube, the lead part, there's a thing called a tube cell nucleus. Behind it are two sperm nuclei, and they come down. They come down through the middle and then up this way. Now, the first sperm fuses with the egg cell, and the other one with this central cell. I'll go into detail in a sec about those two. So again, it's a diagram. We have here's your plant full of flowers. Meiosis is how the eggs and the pollen are produced. Remember, meiosis is where it's a special process where we get haploid cells producing cells which are half the number of the chromosomes. So in humans, every one of our cells, except the sex cells, have 46 chromosomes. The sex cells have 23. So when you get a male and a female meeting, the 223 become 46, and that's your first zygote. I mean, the zygote, the first cell, and then from there you get the babies coming through. So here we have pollen and pollen grains, and down here we have the gametified or the both gametophytes. The phyte, if you remember, means plant, and it's part of the plant that produces gametes, gametophyte. And here the pollen, here the eggs, and then they fertilize, as we just saw. You get the zygote. Notice the 2N here. They all have the N and 2N. You get your fruit. Within the fruit, there's a seed. Within the seed, there's an embryo. Around the embryo is the endosperm, and that's the food for the seed, for the embryo. And it grows under the right conditions. It germinates, so it throws down roots and shoots. And then you get your plant, and the cycle continues on. Now we have two types of seeds. We have the dry fruit seed, if you like in corn, or the fleshy fruit, as in a fruit that we eat. Like this is a peach. So, and the various technical names of different parts. So once the ovule and the pollen tube are combined, a seed develops. And the endosperm contains starch, the carbohydrates, and the fats, and the two are required for the seed to grow, and then to produce the roots and to produce the leaves. It comes from this endosperm. That the energy comes from there, and the nutrients. They may or may not have fleshy fruit. It's still the same, but these guys carry a lot of the within the seed. There's not much there, but there's a lot in here because of the fruit. Now, corn silk, we've all seen that. And these have a large number of pollen tubes. Remember the tube that is growing from the pollen, carries the nuclei, and they're required to fertilize a large number of ovules. So each one of these seeds had its own ovule, and each one of these seeds has a tube linked to it. Now the fruits, different sorts of fruits. So here we have the ovary, if you like, and the seeds in there. And it's a standard sort of, well, there are different sorts of types of fruits, but this is one where the fruits are in there, the seeds are in there, and and the actual fruit itself, the part that we eat, or the animals that eat, is really originally not so much for the consumption of us, but to help the fruit initially to be able to grow, because it's a food supply. Eventually, when animals came around, the fruit changed to attract the animals, the birds, to eat the flesh. In doing so, they will swallow the seeds. And then when they drop their droppings, wherever they drop droppings, the seed will be there because the surrounding part of the seed, it's called the testa, isn't affected by the acids or any other part of the digestive system, and they come out the other end, and then they've got wonderful fertilizer to grow in with. So I put this one in just to show a large number of different fruits. Modern bananas, by the way, if you have a look at a banana closely next time you take a bite out, you'll see little off-white spots. They are primordial seeds. They're not real seeds. You can't grow bananas from seeds today. They don't exist. They're all grown from cuttings. Yeah. The others, coconuts, they have their things. And coconuts, by the way, have a special coat which so that they can float on salt water for an extended period of time until tides take them to a sandy beach somewhere. And if you look at photos of coconuts, they're actually all bent over. So at high tide, when they drop the coconuts, the water will carry them away, and this is how they disperse. You get avocados with one seed, pomegranates with the stories have got over 613, I think is the number. You get blueberries, the whole range, watermelon, but a lot of the modern watermelons do not have the black seeds because they've been modified not to carry seeds. And these guys, apricots, peaches, have one seed. And so on. Strawberries, I don't know if you know, but its seeds are on the outside. It's the only fruit where each little bump here is a seed, but it's on the outside of the plant. Now, I mentioned the number of leaflets that come through. There are two types of flowering plants, the monocotyledons and the dicotyledons. The monocotyledons are called, just for short, we call them monocots, and they only produce one first leaf, and that first leaf is called the cotyledon. That's what's called a monocotyledon. And so grasses, orchids, onions, palms, they're all monocotyledons. The dicots have two first leaves, so that's the majority of flowering plants. So the monocots are called that because they only produce the single leaf there. Now, so within the seed, there are cells which produce the root, and those cells are called the radicle, and they produce the roots. And the coleoptile produces the leaves. Okay, so so they produce single leaf. The flower parts are in multiples of 3. So if you see a flower and there are 3 petals, 6 petals, 9 petals, they are monocotyledons. And if they don't have any flowers, you look at the leaves. And the leaves, the veins which carry the nutrients and the water and so on, are parallel to each other. They're the monocots. These are the older plants. Okay, and when you cut them, like you mow your grass, they actually grow from the middle. So they'll come through constantly, like here, from this diagram here. The dicotyledons, yeah, you've got your radicals and so on, but what you got, they sort of come up like that. They grow up towards the surface, away from gravity. Then they do a U-turn and grow down, so that as this section here grows, it lifts up the seed, and that's the cotyledon, and the 2 leaves come out of it. So these cotyledons, the 2 of, and then you get the standard leaves after that. So you've got whereas here, with the monocots, the roots go straight down and the leaves go straight up. Here, this is interesting, there are no leaves until the seed is out of the soil, and then it grows from there. Now, the flower parts in the dicotyledons, they're in 4s or 5s. So you can see 4, 8, whatever, 5, 10 petals. But also the leaves are reticulated. So that's a dicot and that's a monocot. Very obvious. And the other thing is, this is interesting. There are in dicotyledons, under the bark, there are these buds, and these buds are dormant. If there's damage done to the plant, say you cut a section off, it's been in a fire or whatever, these buds then are stimulated to start growing, and then new leaves, new branches, new leaves come out, and it regenerates. So these buds, they're there in all dicots, and they will just regenerate. I just found this slide. It's not very clear, I think, because I've enlarged it so much. But the monocots in threes, so you get 2, 4, 6 there, you get 3 here, you get 5, you get 4, just to show you. Just going back to this epicormic bud, a bit further on, I'll be talking about Australian plants and how important the epicormic buds are. So I've got some photos there of this. So, so far we've been talking about sexual reproduction, and you get genetic diversity because you get fertilization from sperm and eggs from different individuals. But asexual reproduction, you get identical genetic information as the parent. If it's non-sexual, they just grow themselves. So they have the capacity, plants and animals, which have the capacity to grow asexually, carry this ability from ancient times when the environment is very, very harsh, where they can't find another one of their species to mate with, they will just reproduce asexually. So what they've done, for example, strawberries, they have these runners, so they can grow properly, absolutely properly under normal conditions. But if it's a little bit on the harsher side, or they're not being fertilized here, they will send a runner out, and when it hits the soil, it'll produce little roots and leaves, and then send another one, and then another one. And then once these have established, these runners deteriorate and fade away, and then we got reproduction that way. And if you're deciding to take strawberry plants out, this shows you at what level the soil should be at. There's too deep, too shallow. Okay, spider plants like this one. I'm sure you've all seen it. And they touch the soil, just throw the roots down, grow leaves, and then these runners, they just disintegrate. Mention that. So, and then each of these become an independent, and they become very, very dense, and that's sort of the problem there. Then I should mention, with the density being very high, then you get competition within itself for nutrients, and that could be its demise. You can also have asexual reproduction through cuttings and division. So, for example, many plants can be grown, when you cut a piece of them or you just break them off. So succulents like cacti, when a piece is broken off by an animal or strong wind or something, and a new roots just grow. Geraniums, if you walk past someone's garden and you see near the fence a beautiful geranium, you like the flowers, just break a piece of it off, take it home, stick it into some water, and the roots will come out, and then put into some potting mix after that, and you get a brand new one. I do that. I sneak it out. So here, for example, a cactus, it hits the soil, it sends roots down into the soil, and new plants grow from that. Here's some geraniums. I didn't take this photo, but it's exactly what they look like. Now, there are other forms of asexual reproduction called bulbs, and there are lots and lots of plants that produce bulbs. And I mean, they clump together, and then you can easily break it. Just one bulb, you get a whole new plant coming through. And so that they usually reserve the energy for growing from the bulbs if they can't reproduce sexually. So we don't have an animal of some sort coming along to help them. Now, Australian plants have a very, very strong on epicormic buds. So the fire or some the animal eating them when they're small, or they're being cut down, or whatever, they will regenerate. So I'm sure you've all seen post-fire regrowth, and we've had the fires along the East Coast 2019, 2020, and within a few months, it was all green again. It was due to these epicormic buds. And they activate they're activated when damaged, when the plant is damaged. And then you get the new growth. Here's another one here, post-fire. Very healthy. A lot of Australian trees do not burn that well because their bark is fairly well fire resistant. Now, because Australia is well known for its bushfires, there are lots of plants that have developed mechanism to germinate seeds after a fire. So they release them. So we have these woody capsules, so like acacias, banksias, casuarinas, hakeas, leptospermum, eucalypts. They are woody capsules. And hakeas is another, but they have cones, and their cone, the fruiting body, has got lots of seeds. And with some of them, but the hakeas only have a pair, two. I've got a photo here. So this banksias, after a fire, they've opened up and the seeds are dispersed. Hopefully they're being spread by insects or the wind. Here's a hakea. There's a dint there, and that's where the two seeds were. As you can see, it's regrown itself. So, and the other thing is here, the intense heat of the fire breaks open the seeds in acacias, and then triggers the germination post bushfire, and the seeds are dropped, and then many of the seeds are stored underground by ants for food. Now, acacia seeds, by the way, I don't know if you noticed, all the names, the technical names of the plants I've mentioned are in italics. And that's just technically how that's done, italicized. Now, the inside layer, just you've got the casing, and under that there's a layer of a compound. It's called a phenolic compound, and very impermeable to water. So acacia seeds will not germinate under normal conditions. They germinate when something happens to them. So when it's heated, these are broken down, this compound, and then once that's broken down, water can go in and germination can proceed. So after fire, there's usually rain. Okay, and here is an example: acacia seedlings post a fire. That's normal. I was going to say something, I can't remember. All right, so then we have xerophytes. Now, zero means dry plants. Zero as in photocopier, Xerox. I don't know if you remember back to the original photocopies, they were wet when they came out. And then when Xerox, the company, produced a dry photocopier, they used the name Xerox for that reason. And so we have a plant in Australia called Xanthoria, or Xantheria. There are lots of plants around the world which need fire to stimulate these the seed germination. So Xanthoria or Xantheria, it's also called the grass tree, and they're also called black boys. But I just put it in to let you know in case you hear it. But black boys is not used very much these days. It's not right. So these are xerophytes. They live in extremely dry areas, and it needs, in order to reproduce, it'll produce seeds, but it needs the bushfires to stimulate the flowering and the germination of seeds. And then, when it's a decent bushfire, and if you remember the big fires from the East Coast, there often was there's so much cloud or smoke, it generated its own lightning and it's generated its own rain. And so rain develops after bushfire, which leads to the germination. So it all works really well when there is a bushfire. The seeds are affected, and then the water comes along and they germinate and off they go. Here are a couple of photos. This is the normal Xantheria. Usually they have one, something like two. Most of these in the background have one. And their flowers are up the very, very top. And there are it's an evolutionary process where they use these moths, a particular moth that flies at that level at the particular time of the year. So these long things grow and they stay there. And every year at a particular time, the flowers come out, the moths come along, have something to eat. It's stopping by the pub, and then they pollinate the flowers and then they fly on. But for some reason, so all these stems, they have a name now, I don't know, can't remember. They're all about the same height where the moths fly at that particular altitude. We were in WA a couple of years ago and walking around the bush, and I couldn't resist taking this photo of these Xanthorias, but a triplet. Never seen one before. So that's got 3 heads on the one. I actually went in to see if it's just one stem, and it is. And it's amazing. And that's ended the lesson. So it may have been a little bit on the complicated side, but I hope you're okay with that. If does anyone have any comment, any question? Oh, that's easy. It's plant anatomy, plant physiology, plant history, evolution. It's fascinating. I'm not a botanist. My background is physiology and biochemistry, and I was always in the medical side of it, so I'm more into the animals. But